Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Anybody have any questions before I jump into the lecture? We're going to wrap up chapter 13, and we will start and maybe finish chapter 14 today. So if we do get done with the content today, I'd like to do a final exam review for you on Wednesday during class time. So because we finished the content, that would give me an hour and a half to do the review for you. So let's see how we do. Any questions on anything? Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and start. If I checked correctly, we were, okay. We had gotten through the cranial nerves, and we were looking at the spinal nerves. And this is sort of towards the end of this chapter anyway. The spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs of them. They're paired nerves. They have both a sensory component and a motor component. The sensory component enters the spinal cord on the dorsal surface of the spinal cord, the posterior surface, if you will, the side facing your back. The motor output goes out on the ventral surface, on the front side of the spinal cord, your belly side, if you will. And so the motor nerve leaves from the ventral position of the spinal cord. These 31 nerves are paired. They both have a motor output and a sensory input on each side. So you have 31 pairs of nerves, and each pair has both a sensory and a motor component. You've got 8 in the cervical region, 12 in the thoracic region, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. Now the spinal nerve, the term for the section that connects to the spinal cord are called the roots. You have a ventral root. The ventral root is on the anterior surface of the spinal cord, the front of the spinal cord. This is where the ventral root is, where the motor nerves leave the spinal cord and go out to the effector, to a muscle cell, to a smooth muscle. The skeletal muscle, for example, or to cardiac muscle, or to, as I said, smooth cardiac or skeletal, or to a gland. Most of these are going to be innervating skeletal muscle. The dorsal root is sensory. It picks up information from all the sensory receptors scattered around the body. And it's coming in on the dorsal or posterior side of the spinal cord. And so here's what it looks like. Here is a sensory receptor in the skin coming in on a sensory nerve into the dorsal horn. We call this portion of it the dorsal root, connecting to the dorsal horn. The horn is the extension of the butterfly, or the H. So this is a horn and this is a horn. This is the dorsal horn. This is the ventral horn. The dorsal root of the nerve connects to the dorsal horn. The ventral root of the nerve is connected to the ventral horn. And so you can see that we have sensory, let me go back. There we go. We have sensory input here, motor output here, but the processing of information takes place here in the interneurons. So you have a dorsal root, which is sensory, a ventral root, which is motor, connecting to the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. Dorsal horn connects to the dorsal root. The ventral horn connects to the ventral root. Motor always goes out from the ventral horn into the ventral root. So the motor neuron is always on the ventral side, the front of the spinal cord, if you will. And as I said, we didn't have very much to cover here on to finish chapter 13. So let me stop here, and I will bring up, oops, where'd it go? Here we are. I will bring up chapter 14. As soon as I find it, where'd it go? 13. I'll have to retrieve that. Hang on 1 second. Let's see if I got that right. Okay, we should have everything where I want it now, looking at the autonomic nervous system. So, autonomic nervous system deals with everything that is not affected, controlling the skeletal muscles. Remember, the somatic side controls skeletal muscle, and we're looking at the autonomic side, which controls the smooth muscle. This is part of the peripheral nervous system. It controls the smooth muscles, the cardiac muscles, controls the heart in the sense that it can speed up the heart or slow it down, and the various glands. The autonomic nervous system operates below the radar. It is subconscious. We're not aware of the changes. We're not aware of, oh, I got to sweat, oh, I got to process, I got to push the food through that I've eaten through my digestive tract, and I need to squeeze the muscles around the digestive tract so I can propel it and get it processed. We are constantly adjusting our bodies to meet the demands of what we're doing. Well, they say it's the involuntary nervous system or the general visceral motor system. I've never ever heard it called that except here. it is the autonomic nervous system. It is completely involuntary. So we see right here, here's where we fall into it. There's the peripheral system there, sensory there, that's the afferent sensory information. That's all the sensory input coming in here. Motor goes out. It's either somatic, which is skeletal muscle, or autonomic, which is smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or the glands, and it divides into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Now, while there are similarities, there are some significant differences here between the autonomic, between somatic, skeletal muscle, and autonomic. We have effectors, that are going out to the various structures, to the muscle cells. We have pathways, we have cell bodies, and we have neurotransmitters. However, there are differences in the effectors. The autonomic system doesn't have anything to do with skeletal muscle. Somatic has nothing to do with cardiac or smooth muscle. The neurotransmitters are going to be, some are going to be similar, but some are going to be completely different. We're going to use different neurotransmitters here with different outcomes also. So in the somatic nervous system, skeletal muscle, we're used to this. We have a large axon that goes from a spinal nerve to a skeletal muscle. We have a large nerve that goes there and branches out and to various axon terminals. We control, we have every muscle cell, every skeletal muscle cell is in contact with a motor nerve. We know that, motor units, 300 muscle cells, whatever, and we always use acetylcholine as our neurotransmitter to excite the skeletal muscle. However, in the autonomic nervous system, we have a different approach. We use two neurons. We use what we call a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. The cell body, the preganglionic neuron, the cell body is in the central nervous system. A preganglionic axon extends to the ganglion, to the cell body. So we have a very lightweight axon, the preganglionic axon going to the cell body. We have a postganglionic neuron, which is outside the central nervous system. And that's going to go out to the effector. So we have a two-step process. A preganglionic neuron in front of the cell body, a postganglionic neuron after the cell body. Remember, the ganglia is the cell body. Now, in the autonomic nervous system, just somatic nervous system always uses acetylcholine, and it's always a stimulatory response. Okay, that's skeletal muscle cells. Acetylcholine, neurotransmitter of choice, always excitatory. However, in the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons always release acetylcholine. The preganglionic neurons always release acetylcholine. The ones that are communicating that are, preganglionic, prior to the ganglia. The postganglionic neuron can either release norepinephrine or acetylcholine. And the effect is going to be either stimulatory or inhibitory. Doesn't mean that acetylcholine is going to be stimulatory again. You're going to have norepinephrine or acetylcholine as your postganglionic neurotransmitters. And they can either be stimulatory or inhibitory, depending on where they're going to land and what they're going to do. For example, acetylcholine in the heart is inhibitory. It slows down the heart rate. So norepinephrine is excitatory in smooth muscle around the arterioles, the small arteries in our body. So Now, these systems are going to overlap a lot. You know, the somatic side and the autonomic side are going to have a lot of overlap here. The spinal nerves and the cranial nerves may have both types of neurons, both somatic and autonomic. It depends on what we're doing. For example, the example here that we're given, if we are engaged in some physical strenuous activity using skeletal muscle, well, that skeletal muscle is going to need more oxygen, need more glucose. We're going to increase the heart rate. We're going to need a higher heart rate. So while we are engaged in strenuous physical activity, driven by the somatic side, like pick up, you know, like you're cutting the grass, or you're digging a ditch, or you're lifting weights, or running, or doing something involving your skeletal muscles, to keep those skeletal muscles energized and supplied with oxygen, the autonomic system has to increase the heart rate, cause the blood vessels to dilate, raise your blood pressure, increase your flow, break down more glycogen into glucose. All of this you don't have to pay attention to. The only thing that you're thinking about is digging that ditch, or cutting that grass, or trimming those hedges, or running, or riding your bicycle. You know, you're only controlling the muscles that are pushing that, doing that activity. The autonomic side is doing all the background support, more oxygen, more glucose, get rid of the CO2, break down glycogen to give you the glucose you need, all that other stuff, sweat to release body heat, all those things that we don't have to stop and think about. That's the subconscious control of the autonomic system. So we can have both muscle areas involved, the somatic control and the autonomic control, because you can't do one activity without the other. Now, this is what the neurons look like. At the top, we have the somatic nervous system. There's our typical skeletal muscle neuron, you know, with its long, heavily myelinated axon. You know, one neuron releasing acetylcholine excites the skeletal muscle, we get a contraction. However, below here, we have the autonomic side. Now, the autonomic system is broken out into two components, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, I'll tell you right now, the sympathetic side is the fight or flight side. It is not the dominant side. Parasympathetic is the dominant. Now, so here we have, on the sympathetic side, we have a preganglionic axon that will always release acetylcholine at the cell body. It will always release acetylcholine. The sympathetic neurons, we have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron is myelinated. The postganglionic neuron is not. The preganglionic neuron will always release acetylcholine at the cell body. In the sympathetic side, the postganglionic neuron always releases norepinephrine, always. The preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine. The postganglionic neuron releases norepinephrine. This is in the sympathetic side. On the parasympathetic side, again, you have a myelinated preganglionic axon, and it releases acetylcholine. So everybody uses acetylcholine on their preganglionic axon. Whether you are sympathetic or parasympathetic, everybody uses acetylcholine on the preganglionic axon, or preganglionic neuron. Now, the difference comes in on the parasympathetic side. The postganglionic neuron also uses acetylcholine. So the sympathetic side uses acetylcholine for both its pre- and postganglionic axon. It can be stimulatory, it can be inhibitory. The sympathetic side uses acetylcholine also on its preganglionic axons, but its postganglionic axon uses norepinephrine, which can be stimulatory or inhibitory. So it can, it doesn't matter what the neurotransmitters are. They can, depending on the receptor, they can be stimulatory or inhibitory. The sympathetic side is always going to have norepinephrine as its postganglionic neurotransmitter. Its preganglionic neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. On the parasympathetic side, the preganglionic neurotransmitter is always acetylcholine, and so is the postganglionic neurotransmitter. It's always acetylcholine there too. So now let's move on. So the parasympathetic side, what's it do? Rest, digest, and defecate. It is our relax, restore, rehabilitate, repair, maintenance, energy conservation, things like that. It is the dominant system. Most of our time is spent under control of the parasympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic side is fight or flight. When we need lots of energy to do things quickly, we'll call on the sympathetic division, sympathetic side here. We call it fight or flight because we release a lot of epinephrine and norepinephrine. We do things quickly, short duration activities. We find, though, that most of our organs are dual innervated. That means they're innervated by both the sympathetic side and the parasympathetic side. They have antagonistic responses. For example, the heart is innervated by the parasympathetic side and it releases acetylcholine directly into the heart. It slows down our heart rate. Acetylcholine is inhibitory in the heart. The parasympathetic side releases acetylcholine into the heart to slow the heart rate down. The sympathetic side releases epinephrine into the heart to speed up the heart rate. They are antagonistic responses. One speeds up the heart, one slows down the heart. One uses acetylcholine, one uses epinephrine. One speeds it up, epinephrine, one slows it down, acetylcholine. Dual innervation. Most of our organs have innervation from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic side. Parasympathetic side, everything we can do to slow down our body's energy use. Digestion of food, the nice slow digestion of our breakfast or our lunch. Diuresis, the need to urinate. Defecation, rest, digest, and defecate. After we have a large meal, our body goes into a rest stage. Our blood pressure drops, our heart rate drops, our breathing rate drops. The activity in our gut, though, is very high. We are processing the food that we've eaten. It takes several hours after we eat. From the time we start eating to the time that we get it processed through is about 6 hours. And so we are in this resting stage here where blood pressure is low, heart rate's slowed down, breathing rate's slowed down, activity in the small and large intestine, in the stomach are high. Our pupils are constricted. We can look at things up close. We're not paying attention to anything around us. We're like, maybe we're reading something, or maybe we are watching TV, but we're not paying attention to anything else around us. We are focused on close vision. We have accommodated our lenses for close vision. The pupils are narrowed. We're not letting a lot of light in. We're just looking at things up close. Now, the parasympathetic responses are not going to be, as they say, a systemic effect, because we're going to be doing different things to different organs at different times. We may we have different outcomes of using our parasympathetic neurotransmitter. For example, while we normally think of the parasympathetic side as relaxed and taking it easy, we're going to be using acetylcholine. That's our neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine is what triggers the motility of our gut. It makes our gut, it triggers peristalsis, the movement of food through our gut. It triggers the ability of us to absorb nutrients at a faster pace and move them along. It triggers the churning of our stomach and the churning and swelling and movement in our small and large intestine. It causes our airways to narrow. Acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter is excitatory here. So here we are, we've eaten a big meal. We've slowed down our breathing rate. We narrow the airway. We increase the activity of our gut. The detrusor muscles in the groin have contracted. In the male, it draws the testes up close to the body. These are all excitatory responses from acetylcholine. But at the same time, acetylcholine is lowering our heart rate, dilating the blood vessels in the viscera to increase blood flow to the small and large intestine to absorb nutrients. It causes our peristaltic activities to increase, and it tells our sphincters, urinary sphincter and anal sphincter, to relax. Now, this is all, we don't have an overall systemic response to the parasympathetic system. We don't say, okay, we're releasing acetylcholine, we're going to go into rest and digest and defecate mode, everything's going to relax. Well, that's not true, because we do relax. The heart rate goes down, blood vessels dilate, which means our blood pressure drops, our blood vessels enlarge, blood pressure drops. We increase the action of the digestive system. The sphincters relax in anticipation of urination and defecation, but at the same time, our airway narrows, our gut activity increases, and we start pulling muscles up closer to the body. So we have both a stimulating effect and a relaxing effect at the same time throughout our body. So there is no one systemic effect for the parasympathetic side. Now, so what all do we do? Well, the parasympathetic responses, rest and digest. We want to do maintenance on our body. We want to repair things. Our parasympathetic side is always the dominant side. All these activities are going to be, it's always easier to relax and repair than it is to get excited. So our body always chooses the parasympathetic response unless there's some sort of outside trigger. Now, these responses include, we salivate. When we get hungry, we salivate. That is a parasympathetic response. Lacrimation, eyes water, that's just a parasympathetic response. The need to urinate and defecate and process food is a parasympathetic response. Our heart rate drops. Our airways narrow, pupils narrow. However, there is a very bizarre response here. When we are terrified to the point of overwhelming fear that we can't escape from a situation, we go through a fight or flight response. I haven't got to it yet, but I'll talk about here. Fight or flight response is how our body prepares for extreme stress or extreme fear or anger, or self-preservation. We respond by either standing to fight or run away. We want to survive. That is a sympathetic response. If, on the other hand, we can't win, there's no way to win, we are terrified beyond the point of reason, I guess you could say, then our body undergoes not an additional sympathetic response, but we trigger a parasympathetic response, a massive parasympathetic response. It is not unusual for individuals that are terrified to lose control of their bladder and their bowels. Very common, particularly when exposed to a high stress situation. An individual in combat for the first time will often experience this because they're scared. Combat is a scary activity, and when a person is involved in a life-threatening situation, it's for the very first time, it's not unusual for them to lose control of their bowels or their bladder, or both. Because it's the parasympathetic side is normally controlling defecation and normally controlling urination. Normally what happens that causes us to defecate is that pressure of the fecal matter in the rectum triggers a parasympathetic response. It tells the sigmoid colon and the rectum to, essentially starts causing them to contract and pushing the fecal matter further and further down towards the anus. It also causes the external sphincter, the ring of muscle around the anus, to relax. And this defecation reflex is so powerful that while we can hold it for a while, it is a reflex. The pressure of the fecal matter, the feces in the rectum, triggers the opening of the anal sphincter reflexively, and we empty our bowels. We empty the colon. We empty the sigmoid colon and the rectum. And no matter how hard you try to contain that, there reaches a point where we cannot control it any longer. Now that's normal defecation. Okay, but in an extreme fearful situation, it can happen with no control. So the whole thing behind defecation is driven by the parasympathetic system. All caused by as fecal matter accumulates in the rectum and the sigmoid colon. This little chart here in your PowerPoints shows you, it compares, most of our visceral organs here between the sympathetic and parasympathetic response. For example, the sympathetic system will increase the heart rate. The parasympathetic system will slow it down. The sympathetic side will cause what we say vasoconstriction, narrowing of blood vessels. It will cause dilation of the airway to increase airflow. Because in a fight or flight response, when you are terrified and you're either going to stand and fight or run away to save your life, you are going to restrict blood flow to organs that don't matter. If you're going to stand and fight or you're going to run away to survive, it doesn't matter what your skin's doing. It doesn't matter what your gut's doing. It doesn't matter what your reproductive organs are doing. What matters is that you have enough glucose going to your muscle cells and you have enough oxygen going to your muscle cells and your brain and your heart, and you're sending blood to your brain and heart and lungs and muscles so that you can do something. So you open up your airways, but you restrict blood flow to the skin and to the digestive system and to the reproductive system and to the urinary system because they're not essential right now. Parasympathetic side is going to increase motility of the gut to process food while you relax. It's going to tell the liver to store glucose, create more glycogen. It's going to tell the gallbladder to release bile to break down fat. It's going to tell the kidneys to urinate, to release urine for you. It's going to tell your urinary bladder to constrict and force urine out. And the parasympathetic side is going to stimulate the male and female sexual response. We'll talk about that in AP2, but the ability to become aroused, become sexually aroused in both the male and female are parasympathetic responses. Orgasm in the male, orgasm in the female is a result of the sympathetic response. So we see both of these systems are involved in sexual activity. Okay. So the sympathetic side, we call it fight or flight. The exercise, excitement, emergency, embarrassment system, all these are sympathetic. You know, person gets embarrassed, their face turns red when they get embarrassed. Someone who's excited, their heart rate goes up, is a sympathetic response. When we're experiencing a sympathetic response, our heart rate will go up, our mouth will get dry, we will get cold, our skin will get wet, our pupils will dilate so we can see better. Our skin gets cold because we're not sending as much blood to the skin as we were before. Our mouth is dry because we're not sending a lot of, we're not paying attention to the digestive system. We don't care about the digestive system here. We are sending blood to our muscles and to our heart. We're opening up our airways. We are releasing a load of glucose from our liver so we have the energy to do what we need to do. So we're the brain, the heart, the lungs, and the muscles and the liver are involved. Everything else is just sort of watching. So we call it fight or flight, fight, fright, or flight response. And so our fight or flight, you know, because some people are going to stand and fight, some are going to run away to survive, and some are going to be terrified beyond the ability to reason, and they're going to stand there and be immobilized. And that's not unusual. You know, it's not, it is a, you know, all these responses are chemical. Stand and fight, run away. Not character, but chemical. The whole process of being immobilized by fear is another part of this, where it isn't so much fear as it is processing, coming up with, trying to make a decision. It's the indecision that's driving this. Now, the neurotransmitters involved here, you know, with the sympathetic side is going to be norepinephrine. Norepinephrine from the post-ganglionic neurons, norepinephrine there, but also epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. The adrenal gland has a cortex, the outer covering of it, and the medulla is the inner portion. This is where epinephrine and norepinephrine also get released from. So norepinephrine from the post-ganglionic neuron and epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. The sympathetic responses, fight or flight, physical or emotional stress. You know, you're attacked, you're terrified, you're in a scary situation, you've been in an accident, you see an accident happen in front of you, you respond. Your responses can go three ways. You can run towards the accident, run away from the accident, or stand there and just be paralyzed by indecision because your brain's trying to process what's going on. It's all chemical. In the fight, flight, or fight response, the pupils dilate to let in more light so you can see better. Your heart rate goes up. Your blood pressure goes up. The force of the contraction increases. So you're sending more blood and oxygen and nutrients to the appropriate organs. You're reducing the blood flow to your skin. You don't need to worry about your skin. It's reducing the flow to the digestive system and the reproductive system. You don't need to worry about that. You're sending blood to the cardiac muscle and to the skeletal muscle. The airway dilates to let in so you can breathe better. The breathing rate goes up. Blood glucose level goes up. you're getting more glucose out of your liver. The results of the sympathetic response, it occurs rapidly and takes a long time to tail off. A person who goes into a fight or flight event will often be very, very tired afterwards. It tails off slowly. You know, occurs rapidly with a very quick tail off, or with a very slow tail off here. It takes longer to for the norepinephrine and epinephrine's effects to go away. I've said this already. The gut activity drops, the sphincters contract, you're not worried about peeing, you're not worried about defecating. The ciliary muscle changes the shape of the lens so you can see better. And your pupil enlarges drastically. Your pupil gets very wide, so you can, people often said, your eyes just got real big. Yeah, because they're experiencing a fight or flight response. They got real big so they could see better. Not something that you think about. We've often said, well, your eyes got real big there for a second. So yeah, it's a fight or flight response. Okay. So we see that the sympathetic side is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. There's three big differences between these two. Now, these systems have to work together. Now, first of all, where do they come? Where do the sympathetic and parasympathetic sides come from? The parasympathetic nerves start in the brain. It's sort of like the top and the bottom of the central nervous system. The parasympathetic nerves start in the brain and also down at the sacrum. So the top and the bottom of the spinal cord, brain and spinal cord, in the brain and in the sacrum. The sympathetic nerves come out in the thoracic and lumbar regions. They sort of come in the middle. They look so like this. There's parasympathetic either from the brain or from the sacrum here. The sympathetic are all here in the middle, like this. So that's the first thing. Now that's the first difference. Parasympathetic, essentially top and bottom of the central nervous system. Sympathetic in the middle. The second difference is the length of their neurons. The parasympathetic side has very long preganglionic neurons and very short postganglionic neurons. The sympathetic is just the opposite. The sympathetic has very short preganglionic neurons and very long postganglionic neurons. The other difference is, where are the cell bodies, the ganglia? Well, the parasympathetic side, the ganglia are near the effector. So they're at the end of this, they got that long preganglionic neuron. And so the cell body is close to the effector. And on the sympathetic side, they have the short preganglionic. The ganglia is close to the spinal cord, and they got that long neuron going out to the effector. So it looks like this. Here's your parasympathetic with its long preganglionic. There's the cell body, and very short postganglionic neuron all along in here. Over here, just the opposite. The sympathetic preganglionic neuron is short. The cell bodies are close to the spinal cord, and they have very long postganglionic neurons. And this is a good little, if the other slide's too busy, this is a good one showing you where everything is. Parasympathetic brain and sacrum. Brain and sacrum with long pre-ganglionic and short post-ganglionic with the cell bodies near the effector. The sympathetic is from the middle of the spinal cord, thoracic and lumbar. It has the short preganglionics and the long postganglionics with the cell bodies near the spinal cord. So, and just said all that. So, and just said all that too. Now, so what about the sensory neurons? We've been talking about motor. Sympathetic and parasympathetic are all motor. Everything there is motor, whether it's innervating speeding up the heart rate or slowing down the heart rate. This is all motor. What about sensory? Visceral sensory information is telling us what's going on internally. Whether are we stretching our small intestine as we're processing food through it? Has our temperature gone up or gone down? Do we have an inflammation in the viscera? Does our gallbladder have an issue? Does our appendix have an issue? Do we have a lot of gas? Do we have a lot of distension of enlargement of the colon or the small intestine because we've eaten a lot of something that's going to cause a lot of gas for us and make us uncomfortable? The sensory endings for the visceral nerve, the visceral sensory nerves are just dendrites. Remember, they're free nerve endings. Remember what a dendrite is. The dendrite can be the free nerve ending. Only the special senses are found in the head, nowhere else. The visceral senses are detected by dendrites. And the visceral sensory receptors tell us what's going on in the viscera. Now, the problem with this is that the visceral sensory receptors travel in the same pathways as the autonomic motor nerves. And so the autonomic motor nerves, which are monitoring what's going on with motor activities, they're also carrying the sensory input. And this viscera, thanks to the autonomic motor nerves, sensations in the viscera often are telling us that we've got a problem but it's detected in the wrong place. Referred pain is because pain signals are traveling on the same motor nerve for the autonomic nervous system. Because the nerves are mixed, they have sensory and motor components. And so now we're getting signals coming in saying, well, we have a pain in our left arm when we really have a heart attack. When we really have pain in our heart, or we have pain in our right shoulder while we really have a problem with our gallbladder. So these visceral neurons, these visceral sensory neurons, since they're traveling the same pathways as the autonomic muscle neurons, muscle axons, are giving us false signals because that muscle neuron is traveling from the vagus nerve, stimulating the heart rate or slowing down the heart rate. Well, we have a pain signal going on that same pathway. So, but it's the pain signals from the viscera, in the abdomen. So we had, instead of having chest pain from our heart attack, we've got a pain down in our abdomen, or we have a pain in our lower jaw. That's not where our heart's located, but that's where the pain's being perceived. So something else about our viscera is we have our reflexive arc. Our reflex arcs in here are very similar to a spinal reflex, but there is one difference. Well, actually, it's three, but the big difference is that there are two neurons in the pathway. Normally we have a receptor, a sensory neuron, an integration center, a motor neuron, and an effector. But the reflex arc here has two neurons in the motor pathway out. The other big difference is that these are visceral sensory neurons, and we are also not going to have a skeletal muscle response. Visceral reflexes, great example here, emptying the bladder. You have to pee. When the bladder fills up with urine, it reaches a point where we can no longer hold our bladder. We have to pee. We've all experienced that, where we just can't hold it any longer, and we got to find a place to empty our bladder, or our rectum. Pressure of fecal matter in the rectum triggers that parasympathetic response, and we end up with a reflexive action to open up the sphincter. There's a point where we can't control it any longer. That is a visceral reflex. So here's how it works. There's our receptor, number one, there's our receptor, just like before. A visceral sensory neuron, just like a skeletal reflex. Put your hand down something hot, yank it back. We have an integration center right there at number three. Number three is the integration center. We are processing the information, but the output has two neurons involved here, a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron, leading to the effector. And so here, instead of being a simple, motor neuron going out to the effector, we have a pre and post ganglionic neuron involved in the process here, and we get our reflex that way. It's a visceral effector. And our neurotransmitter is going to be acetylcholine or norepinephrine. So the neurotransmitters involved here, acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is the parasympathetic side. Acetylcholine is the same as we use in skeletal muscle. Cholinergic fibers release acetylcholine. All preganglionic axons release acetylcholine. All parasympathetic postganglionic axons release acetylcholine. Norepinephrine, the neurotransmitter from the sympathetic side, adrenergic fibers. All postganglionic axons in the sympathetic side release norepinephrine. Now, the effect depends on what kind of receptor is present. Is it a cholinergic receptor for acetylcholine? Is it an adrenergic receptor for norepinephrine? Remember, adrenergic, it's where the term adrenaline came from, because we're talking about the adrenal gland. Norepinephrine and epinephrine used to be called adrenaline. Now we know that there are two different proteins. One is norepinephrine, one is epinephrine. And so we can't say adrenaline anymore. We call them by their proper name. Okay. So again, remember, don't forget that if it's parasympathetic, the neurotransmitter at the pre and post ganglionic axon is always norepinephrine. It can be excitatory, it can be inhibitory. On the sympathetic side, the preganglionic neurotransmitter is always acetylcholine. The post-ganglionic neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. Also remember that the sympathetic nervous system has the short preganglionic axons and the long postganglionic axon. And the parasympathetic has the long preganglionic and the short postganglionic. Okay, so cholinergic receptors for acetylcholine, adrenergic receptors for norepinephrine. Here is an example of a sympathetic response. There's your preganglionic neuron releasing acetylcholine. There are what we call nicotinic receptors on the ganglia. Nicotinic receptors respond to acetylcholine. There's two types of receptors for acetylcholine. Nicotinic is one of them. On the postganglionic neuron, since this is the sympathetic side, the neurotransmitter is norepinephrine, and it lands on its effector cell or gland or wherever it's supposed to be landing. We use acetylcholine for the preganglionic neurotransmitters all the time. The postganglionic neurotransmitter, acetylcholine or norepinephrine. In this case, since it's sympathetic, it is norepinephrine. Cholinergic receptors, acetylcholine. That's where the term cholinergic comes from. They are nicotinic or muscarinic. The names the names are based on the drugs that bind to these receptors and, as I say, mimic the effects of acetylcholine. Nicotine is excitatory. It causes our blood vessels to constrict. It raises our blood pressure. It raises our, causes our heart rate to slow down. Muscarinic is like from poisonous mushrooms. Regardless of that, the names are nicotinic and muscarinic. You have a nicotinic receptor, you have a muscarinic receptor. The nicotinic receptors is always a stimulatory response. Skeletal muscle would be a nicotinic receptor. Nicotinic receptors are on all of the postganglionic neurons. Sympathetic and parasympathetic, all on the postganglionic neurons. We find that receptors on all postganglionic neurons, whether they're sympathetic or parasympathetic, because remember, how do we trigger the postganglionic neuron to do something? The preganglionic neuron is always releasing acetylcholine on either the sympathetic or parasympathetic side. Doesn't matter. It always uses acetylcholine. So the receptors are going to be on the postganglionic neuron regardless of whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. It's the neurotransmitter at the end that determines what's going to happen. Nicotinic receptors are found on skeletal muscle. That's what we have at the motor end plate, at the neuromuscular junction. Those are nicotinic receptors. It is always going to be a stimulatory response. We are always going to cause a depolarization. We're always going to depolarize on the postsynaptic side. Now, muscarinic receptors are going to be at the end of the postganglionic neuron. Muscarinic receptors are going to be at the effector. Acetylcholine on nicotinic receptors, acetylcholine is always excitatory. On the muscarinic receptors, it can be excitatory or inhibitory. For example, acetylcholine landing on cardiac muscle cells is inhibitory. It slows down our heart rate. The same acetylcholine, when it lands in our gut, is excitatory. It raises our heart rate, our digestive rate on how we process our food. So the same acetylcholine that lands in our heart and causes our heart rate to slow down, when it's dumped into the gut, causes us to become excited. Muscarinic receptors can be either or. They can either be excitatory or they can be inhibitory. Nicotinic receptors are always excitatory. Muscarinic are both. So, the adrenergic receptors can be alpha receptors or beta receptors. And it depends on what the norepinephrine is going to do. Norepinephrine causes the heart rate to go up. Epinephrine causes the bronchi to relax. It depends, we have alpha receptors and beta receptors. It depends on what the reaction is going to be, depending on which receptor they land on. Beta-1 receptors causes an excitatory response in the heart. Norepinephrine in the heart causes the heart to go up because it hits beta-1 receptors. But if we hit the airway, norepinephrine there lands on beta-2 receptors, which causes the airway to dilate. There's a whole class of medications to control blood pressure called beta blockers that block the beta-1 receptors in the heart. Just for an example there, what good is knowing beta-1 versus beta-2? Well, beta-1, if we block the beta-1 receptor, we can slow down the heart rate and lower blood pressure. Okay. Now, so we have adrenergic, and we have alpha and beta type receptors in our bodies, and they determine what the outcome is going to be. Norepinephrine can either be excitatory or inhibitory depending on the receptor at the target organ. Okay. But most of our organs are going to be, well, as we say, dual innervated with antagonistic outcomes. The sympathetic side is antagonistic usually to the parasympathetic side. However, when they work together, which they will because they're going to be antagonistic, they will reach some level of control. They'll reach a very good level of control because we don't let one side be dominant over the other very long. We exert control so that we maintain a sort of a neutral state, a balanced state, a homeostatic state, if you will. So while one side, like the sympathetic side, is going to increase the heart rate and increase the breathing rate and restrict defecation and digestion, the parasympathetic side will lower the heart rate, lower the breathing rate, allow digestion to occur and defecation to take place. And so we're going to stay balanced. Whatever one side blocks, the other side will allow. Whatever one side allows, the other side will block. It also depends on the situation. In a very stressful fight or flight response, your body's not going to be worried about needing to empty their bowels. Unless, of course, you blast right past the sympathetic response and go back into parasympathetic and lose control over your bowel and bladder. Okay. Now, there is one example here. Smooth muscle around our blood vessels. It's what allows our blood vessels to enlarge or to shrink. We call it vasodilation when our blood vessel enlarges, and vasoconstriction when they shrink, when the diameter of the vessel shrinks. This is controlled only by the sympathetic side. The way it controls the size of our blood vessel is the sympathetic nervous system will release norepinephrine into the smooth muscle around our blood vessel. Norepinephrine causes the smooth muscle to constrict and the blood vessel will narrow. When we stop releasing norepinephrine, the vessel will relax or dilate. So we control the size of our blood vessels, the diameter of our blood vessels, by either releasing norepinephrine or not releasing norepinephrine. We don't have any counteracting influence from the parasympathetic side. Because it is so important to be able to move blood around or restrict the movement of blood around in our bodies, we can just use this one neurotransmitter. So. Now, one of the things about our blood vessels, though, is that we're always going to keep the blood vessels slightly constricted. Just like in skeletal muscle, having muscle tone, we have what's known as sympathetic tone. We keep all of our vessels in a very slightly constricted state, and it's easier to constrict them quicker if we need to. It's also easier to let them dilate as needed also. We're always moving blood around. We don't have enough blood in our bodies to fill every vessel. We're always about 1 or 2 units shy of a full load. So we're always moving blood around to where we need it. On a hot day, you go outside and you're going to send lots of blood to your skin. You're not aware that you're doing it, but you're going to radiate extra heat and you're going to sweat. On a cold day, you're going to restrict the flow of blood to the skin so you don't lose heat. This is a sympathetic response. Okay. Now, the parasympathetic side is always going to maintain its own level of tone too. This parasympathetic tone slightly innervates the digestive tract, the urinary tract, so that they can respond quicker. But this parasympathetic tone can be overridden during a period of high stress. And anything that blocks the parasympathetic response will cause our heart rate to go up and cause fecal retention and urinary retention. What are we talking about here? Certain medications cause constipation, pain medication, drugs based off of morphine, or codeine, or like the Tylenol 3 or Percocet or drugs like that. They lower the motility of the gut so that your patient that's taking these pain medications will become constipated. The reflexive action to empty the bowels isn't occurring. So lots of medications do this. The urge to urinate may be retained, maybe blocked, but the big one is going to be constipation. Lots of pain medications are going to block the fecal reflex, if you will, the defecation reflex. And while they are either, there are a few cases where they are single innervation, like muscle, like around the smooth muscle around the blood vessels. Normally we are antagonistic, but there is one case where they are cooperative. This is in the sexual arousal. You'll hear all about this in AP2. The parasympathetic fibers cause our dilation of blood vessels. For the parasympathetic system increases blood flow to the penis and to the clitoris. The clitoris enlarges and becomes erect, just like the penis does. And this increased blood flow will occur as the male or female becomes more and more sexually aroused. And the tactile stimulation of the penis or the clitoris will bring them to orgasm. But orgasm, ejaculation, and as I say, the reflexive contraction of the vagina are sympathetic responses. So the parasympathetic side brings your male and female to the height of arousal. The sympathetic response triggers orgasm in both. So the two systems are working together in here for that. A couple of things that are unique on the sympathetic side only. You know, this whole temperature thing about skin is a sympathetic response only. When our temperature goes up, we dilate our blood vessels. We send more blood to the skin to get rid of more heat. We turn on our sweat glands. That is a sympathetic response only. The same thing when we get cold, we constrict those vessels. That's still a sympathetic response. Did you know that when your hairs stand up because you're cold, you have goosebumps? Goosebumps are a result of the sympathetic nervous system. Goosebumps. You know, the need to raise the hairs on your skin to try and trap air to keep you warm is a sympathetic response. So renin, we haven't talked about renin yet. Renin is a chemical released by the kidneys that can trigger a rise in blood pressure. You'll hear all about that in AP2 also. But the kidneys actually can play a major role in raising blood pressure when we need to. The sympathetic system can also trigger the release of glucose from the kidney and from the liver. You know, we have a lot of glucose sequestered in our liver in the form of glycogen. And we can break that down and release a lot of glucose all at once when we need to. We can also break down fats. Again, it's sympathetic only. Something else we notice with the two systems is that the parasympathetic system is short-lived. Acetylcholine does its thing. It gets broken down by acetylcholinesterase right away. It does not have a long-lasting effect. The sympathetic side, someone who's gone through a crisis or an emergency is going to have a longer time to deal with that crisis event. Acetylcholine breaks down, norepinephrine breaks down much slower. They have a longer lasting effect. You've probably seen individuals at the site during an emergency after the event's over. Perhaps they're standing by the site of an accident and it's a hot day and yet they're wrapped in a blanket because they're cold. Because in the sympathetic response, we shut down blood flow to the skin. You know, we don't care about the skin, so the skin gets cold. And so you wrap them in a blanket to keep them warm. They may be very tired because they've had this sudden surge of energy during the crisis, and they're still getting that surge, and now they're getting really tired. Long lasting, you know, they may want to go to sleep. They're exhausted, you know, after the crisis effect. So. How many more slides I have? Okay, let me just. Okay. Okay. So as I said, parasympathetic, short-lived, sympathetic, long-lasting. Many people that go through a crisis mode here are going to take a long time to recover. They want to go to sleep. They're cold. They might be hungry, but it will take a long time. It will take minutes as opposed to seconds. It will take minutes to hours before they feel better. Now, one of the problems we encounter, and we'll talk about this in AP2, is something called neuropathy. Individuals that have diabetes, diabetes mellitus may develop neuropathy, meaning that they have difficulty in sensing pain or touch or pressure. Part of it has to do with reduced blood supply to the sensory nerves. Your patient, this is where your patient ends up bruising their leg or their foot or even their hand and not feeling it, and then having it become infected because of the poor blood supply. We see it, excuse me, individuals that have poor blood flow because of diabetes often start losing their vision in here. If the autonomic nerves are damaged as a result of poor blood supply from diabetes, because the diabetes is interfering with blood flow, you may start seeing autonomic responses being impaired. They may not sweat properly. They may get dizzy because they can't maintain their blood pressure. They may become incontinent. So a lot of these conditions can occur in your diabetic patient. We'll talk a lot about that also in AP2 now. So who controls the autonomic nervous system? Well, mostly the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus monitors and controls everything. The hypothalamus is dominant. It can also draw in the limbic system here in your autonomic control, but it is primarily the hypothalamus. So, okay. Let's see what else I want to say about this. Now, the hypothalamus can control the activity of the heart, doesn't control the beat. It can control, regulate blood pressure. It is the thermostat of the body. It regulates and monitors our water levels and all of our endocrine activities. It also deals with our emotional responses to stress, rage, fear, pleasure, arousal, hunger. All these are emotional responses. The limbic system takes its cue from environmental signals around you. Are you afraid? The cingulate gyrus, the amygdala, give the limbic system the signal of what's going on, and the hypothalamus then will trigger the fight or flight response. So you're walking down a dark street late at night and you hear funny noises behind you, and you start running because you're afraid. Because the external cues trigger your limbic system to make you scared, and your hypothalamus says, okay, fight or flight time. Let's see. Yeah. One more thing. Now, one condition that we encounter a lot, Raynaud's disease, vasoconstriction in the fingers and toes. Why does it occur? Because the we have vasoconstriction of blood vessels caused by too much norepinephrine being released. The autonomic nervous system is getting too many cues to stimulate these muscle cells. How do we deal with it? We deal with it. We use vasodilators to counteract the norepinephrine. We may use nitric oxide, nitroglycerin, for example, as our vasodilator. Okay, so that is chapter 14. I told you it was short. Let me get out of here. And so now we are done with the content for 13 and 14. I would really like to be able to do your final exam review in this class time on Wednesday. So if you can't make it, if you can't be here, that's okay. I will record it and post it in YouTube, so you can go back and watch it at your leisure. But I will tell you that the final exam review is going to be really helpful for your success on the final. people do better when they go through the review. I'll just say that. It's up to you. It's if you've done well all along, then maybe you don't need to attend. That's perfectly fine. Lots of people do well without coming to the review. Lots of people do well if they come to the review. So, anybody have any questions on anything? Okay, then I'm going to get us out of here, and I will see you on Wednesday for the review.